for this last day of the CASE 2020 conference. I'm very glad to welcome Matthias Jarke for this last keynote of the conference. Matthias is a professor of database and information systems at Aachen University, and he's director of the Fraunhofer Institute of Applied Information Technology. He had a master's degree in computer science and business administration. And after this master's degree, he received a doctorate in business informatics from the University of Hamburg. And he served on the faculties of Stern School of Business at New York University and at the University of Passau before joining RWTH Aachen in 1991. Previous positions include presidents of the German Informatics Society, and he was member of the Fraunhofer Presidential Board. In terms of research, he investigates conceptual modeling and metadata management in business, engineering, and culture. He is currently co-speaker of the German National Excellence Cluster Internet of Production. He is initiator of the Fraunhofer Center for Digital Energy in Aachen. He has served on many editorial boards, and in particular, he's been the program chair of CASE in 1999 and 2014. And of course, we also remember his action at VLDB and other conferences. He is a member of the Acatech National Academy of Engineering and Sciences and a fellow of ACM and the German Informatics Society. I must say I'm extremely pleased to welcome him for this keynote. I know him since quite a long time, actually since I started my PhD at the Sorbonne. And I guess it was in 1995, 25 years ago. Long time. It was the Nature project at that time. As usual, switch off your mobile phone unless you use it for watching this presentation. Switch off anything that could disturb you during the keynote, emails, social networks, and so on and so forth. And don't hesitate to ask questions. You can use the WOVA platform via the question and answer system. You can also use the question and answer system of the Zoom webinar system. And please avoid use the chat system because it's actually difficult to track down the questions in the chat system. Matthias, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Camille. 25 years is a good reason to celebrate. So this was the best student team that I ever had in one of my projects with Neil Maiden, Klaus Pohl, George Vanudakis, and many other interesting people. And so we look back to that a lot. On the picture for this top slide, which I hope you can all see already, you see in the background the so-called RWTH campus, which is an industry campus associated to our university with a lot of research labs, both from industry and from university and from extra university institutions such as Fraunhofer. So we use it as a prototype environment, so to speak, for our what we are aiming at, which is called the Worldwide Lab. In such an environment, we have seen in Fukushima crisis, but also recently in the COVID-19 crisis, that resilience of process chains in industry is an extremely important aspect. At the same time, companies want to protect what they want, what we call data sovereignty. And for this reason, about 6 years ago, I co-initiated with two colleagues what is now called the International Data Spaces Initiative, or International Data Space Association, that you see in the logo on the lower corner, and on which I will come back later on. Okay, the outline of my talk will be like this follows. I first want to introduce the concept of alliance-driven data ecosystems, which is a concept for data sovereignty, together with this initiative. Then I would look at the special case of the production cluster that I just introduced. And finally, I will look a little bit more formally at conceptual abstractions that we need for this idea of data sovereignty. I begin with the definition of data ecosystems and the concept of data sovereignty. I'm sorry for this very full slide. Most of the others will be pictures, so don't worry. Data ecosystems, in a simple way, can be defined as sharing and exchanging data for creating value, but also for sharing the value, for the fair value appropriation in some domain of interest. Could be medicine, could be industry, or other things. And within such an ecosystem, data sovereignty can be defined very simplistically as the freedom to determine how my data are used by anyone else. But the question of my data is hotly debated even in politics nowadays. One thing has become clear after 10 or 15 years of negotiation, which is the European General Directive on personal rights. Because data, if I say my data is data about me as a person, then according to this guideline, I'm the owner and must give permission for many users. You notice that very often when you use websites. Especially in Europe, the case is much, much more complicated for companies. And for artifacts, data artifacts that we have produced within such a company, that does not exist in Europe. I was very surprised to hear that recently from a member who had been a co-author of the GDPR and for a very well-known legal professor in this field. He clearly said there is no clearly defined concept of data ownership in Europe. So it is by no means clear that if you have done a fantastic data mining task and are careless with your data, that the results then they cannot be used by somebody else. The only thing that we have is copyright protection. This was a great surprise to many people in our Darkstuhl seminar on this topic a little while ago, and is one of the reasons why judges in lawsuits and the computer science professor, they ask for help. They cannot talk to each other on a common ground at the moment. So big gap. And then, of course, there are also the states. So the third definition of sovereignty is, of course, state sovereignty, country sovereignty, or European sovereignty. In Europe, the goal of the states and the EU as a whole is, of course, that they want to regulate the action with data, but again, it is not completely clear how much they can do, for example, in comparison to the international internet companies. So we see that security as well as data sovereignty are not at all objective concepts. If politicians talk to us about security, they can mean their own security. So I want more bodyguards. They can ask for control over us, which is exactly against our own data sovereignty, and so on and so forth. And this differentiates two different kinds of data ecosystems that in a recent paper in the journal Electronic Markets we have called keystone player-driven data ecosystems, which are the ecosystems like Facebook, Google, Amazon, that run dominant platforms, determine their own rules, and profit basically from advertising or similar other large-scale networks effects. In contrast, there are beginning to form alliances of other data ecosystems, for example, by small and medium companies that want to set up their own rules and platforms to maintain the sovereignty over valuable data that they produce and which are not automatically legally protected, as I mentioned above. Okay, data sharing obviously can be observed in many ecosystems nowadays. I show here some examples of material sciences, of energy knowledge, where it is particularly important with renewable energies, for example, for predictive asset maintenance or for shared control over renewable energies. In manufacturing and logistics, this will be our topic today. In healthcare, we see this, for example, in communities for COVID-19 research nowadays, and also in the smart city sector. Here's a little bit of an example, motivating example for collaborative predictive maintenance. We see here two machine operators that, just as examples, or actually N of them, that work with a maintenance service provider and send this provider maybe process data to be analyzed. Of course, the service provider cannot understand them without getting product lifecycle management data from the machine manufacturer that all these machine operators are using. And then we see also very different goals for the users, basically that they have a continuous availability of their machines and thus a higher productivity. For the service providers, which are in competition to each other, to differentiate each other, to be profitable by data sharing, for example, by combining the experiences from many of the operators, and of course also from retaining the customers that they have, because acquisition of cold customers is much more difficult. For the manufacturer, or I noticed that it has been forgotten on the slide, of course, it means finding out problems with their machinery, developing the next object, and so on. This is moving too fast. In such settings, in this IDS initiative, we have asked a lot of companies, supported by PricewaterhouseCoopers, who is participating there also. And the biggest problems, as you can see, are worries about revealing valuable data and business secrets, the fear of lost control over their data. So people they have given for one purpose to another company can be used for a side effect. This is data sovereignty, the ability to control the usage. Also, of course, interoperability concerns that we have been a lot concerned with in processes and in systems within the case conference over many years in the past. And also, of course, the business side, that the critical mass of partners cannot be reached so that the data sharing is actually creating sufficient value. As I mentioned recently, a number of alliance-driven platforms have been developed in particular domains. Very interesting example is the example in the middle, where you have the two strongest competitors in farming, high-level farming equipment, which you see there, which are Claas from Germany and John Deere from Canada and the United States. And the Claas company has set up a network with, let's say, large farmers, with suppliers and so on, which proved to be quite useful and profitable for data exchange, especially learning about intelligent farming, giving recommendations of how to use the equipment to farmers and so on and so forth, even though they are competitors. And actually, this activity became so successful that John Deere, who is for 100 years, both exist over 100 years actually, has been their fiercest competitor, that they also joined this community because they felt that strongly, first of all, the network effects are stronger than, let's say, this competition problem. And second, also that in this way they could become independent from the IT platform companies. In this paper in electronic markets, we have made a detailed comparison between the comparison-driven platforms and the alliance-driven platforms based on lots of empirical analysis and literature research. This whole table is taken from the paper and in the proceedings, so you can have a look at that. The important point is that the platform boundaries resource is in these alliance-driven platforms or alliances, not just at the technical level of APIs or software development kits, and of the social boundary resources, for example, the availability of sufficient personnel. But the data itself is becoming an important boundary resource, so we must much more carefully think about what are valuable data objects, how can we abstractly define something like a valuable data object, how does exchange of services work in this case at the conceptual level, and how do you organize this whole thing, and I'll talk about many of these aspects later on. Okay, here's a long list that we are trying to address in a sequence of projects with many different partners, and which are also open to other partners, as I will mention at the end, throughout Europe in particular, but even beyond that. So we must think about novel approaches to data exchange, for example, where we had this nice keynote of Maurizio Lenzerini last year. We have to talk about not just access rights, but also usage rights, usage policies. The provenance of data is a very important aspect of the data user, so that they can estimate how much they can trust them. And there's a lot of questions also about minimizing the amount of data that need to be transported. All these aspects will have to be considered in a solution to this problem. Okay, so the original approach that we took at the technical level was to develop mostly two main conditions and concepts for products as part of a reference architecture that is published and cited in the proceedings paper. which is connectors, the IDS connectors, which can have different degree of trustworthiness in terms of security, and essentially are something like secure wrappers by which data come in, so queries are sent out or services are requested and data sent out. There are the original data sources, companies participating in the community, but also various service platforms, for example, data marketplace or private cloud offerings for those companies that are not big enough to run their own cloud, or where subgroups of companies want to share clouds. And then, of course, clouds of different kinds, including some for Internet of Things. The second part is this IDS usage conditions, these ones here, and they basically define negotiated usage policies and also enforce them across the system. There can, of course, be connections between companies and services and so on outside this system, but then for those aspects here, for example, this connection between the private cloud and the marketplace that someone is using, there are no guarantees provided by the industrial data space. The ideas of this have been invented, so to speak, in the early phase in late 2014 by just a few people, including myself. But then it has broadened out into over 100 companies. You see some logos here, and 300 people from 20 countries are currently contributing to essentially setting these standards or reference models, and also building prototypes for that, because the whole system is supposed to be completely open so that nobody can monopolize the services. Now I want to talk about one specific use case, which is our cluster Internet of Production, probably also the largest of these use cases. About 100 people involved, budget of 50 million euros, 7 years duration, and so on and so forth. And in this production sector, we have a number of special problems that have to be considered, which are shown in this slide. So in the beginning, in the development environment for production systems, let's say for production machinery, we have many proprietary data already that are linked to product data, CAD data, simulation data, but also, let's say, SAP administrative data, which need to be integrated. So there's already a small community internally, and of course also many different scientific disciplines involved here. Same for the production environment, where all these data in the production process are produced. We see many things that are discussed in case, such as process data, process mining aspects, and ERP data, and corresponding data mining maybe within the production sector itself. But it has been well known, even in software engineering, that the production people and the development engineers do not easily talk to each other, and as a consequence to that, the DevOps approach that we have developed in software engineering is also considered nowadays in this machine engineering sector. Finally, the devices are out on the street. So maybe here we are making printing machines. This is one of the real world use cases. Here we're making printing machines. In the development environment, they are engineered with all kinds of research contributions. And here, of course, we have a very complex production chain and linkages to the customers. But in the usage of these machines in many places throughout the world, it is extremely important to also get the feedback there. And of course, also to feed this back, not just in the production environment, but also in the proprietary system. I sketch one very complex such example, real world example, which is not a use case of ours, but one of the really largest settings, which also has a lot of French connections, so that seemed to be appropriate for this conference, which was supposed to be in Grenoble. And here we see the three roles. The users in this case are mostly the railway operators and of course their customers as the users of the user, so to speak. But there are also the manufacturers of the trains, for example, which are supported by suppliers which have specific domain knowledge, for example, here Knorr-Bremse from brakes and so on. And also, of course, from energy suppliers. So we see there are lots of activities that could profit from more information sharing there. The German train system, which has actually hired one of our professors as the digitalization managers, are looking into condition monitoring, predictive maintenance, autonomous trains, obstacle detection, on-time service, driver observation, and so on and so forth. In the industry, we also see a much speeded up innovation process, especially in the field of electric cars, where of course Tesla is the high-end offering. The lowest end offering is a company called Ego, founded by one of our colleagues in the cluster personally, and the first German new car factory for many, many years. He tried to build a low-cost city car which underwent within just 2 or 3 years of its development many very serious design changes, from steel to aluminium, from very small car legal setting to a normal car legal setting because customers said it was too small, which had then implications for higher voltage in the engine of the car because it was getting more complex and heavier again, and then experiments, of course, with initial users. And when all this happened, after this picture was drawn, then Corona happened and they had big supply problems in their factory. So we see in this use case, which is a real use case in our cluster, many, many different things. Okay, here's just a quick picture of, let's say, the real setting in which we are doing this research together with all kinds of industrial partners in the engineering sector, also in the software sector. I now come to a little bit more, but not very much, theoretical part of my talk, which is what are the conceptual abstractions that we can use to answer the list of challenges that I put up a while ago in one of the previous slides that we have identified there with the customer. So we see from, we see, of course, that we really need something like data usage policies as important contract elements. But in order to make these contracts, we somehow need a good abstraction of what actually is traded when we say we trade data objects and we share data objects. And our claim, also elaborated a little bit in an exploratory paper in this conference, is this idea of digital shadows, which I will show on some slides again, which are supposed to be tradable. They are easily transportable. They must be small. They are traceable. So have things like provenance and context information, where they were created, quality information of other kinds, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we need, so to speak, ideas about the business models. The point about the business models, the main point in data ecosystems, as that in contrast to the models provided by Osterweider and Pigneur, for example, that we know very well in the case community, we have to pursue here a service dominant logic, because much of the exchange is not happening based on exchange of money, but on exchange of service. And I will end with a statement that much of these ideas have become just European policy, so there's a research opportunity for many participants here. Okay. When we speak about Internet of Production, we speak about something like cyber physical production systems. And in this setting of the Industry 4.0, International Standardization Committee has defined this RAMI 4.0 reference architecture model for Industry 4.0, which essentially describes a socio-technical real system, so a system of people and technologies, machine technologies, accompanied by some kind of digital twin, which should be something like a near real-time simulation to analyze what's going on in the real system or to control what's going on in the real system. The linkage between both parts is, of course, sensors and actuators in the Internet of Things. And we have many dimensions, so this is a very complex picture, which we need also, of course, in its full beauty when we think about the overall architecture of such an Internet of Production, which allows worldwide sharing across organizational boundaries in a controlled setting. So it's a very complex thing. And in the digital twin literature itself, there's always mentioned a kind of second-class trace-based memory, which usually is called the digital shadow. When we heard the word digital shadow, this is also one of my personal experiences, I had two associations. The first association was going back about 2,500 years to Platon's famous cave allegory, in which he tries to show the limitations of human knowledge. We assume that humans are the ones which are fixed here on particular seats, so that the only thing that they can see are the shadows on the wall. The shadows are provided by some light, which could be a real light from the sun, which comes here from the opening, or it could be also a fire. And if you use this fire, you could even use it for something like fake news. So you could provide an artificial reality. So Platon was already thinking about fake news that should be much more read in discussing about current activities in the internet. Okay. And I have now been only 40 years in data management research, but nevertheless, all 50 years of data management experience since early IBM applications in the 60s, let us rephrase Plato's claim of these limitations of human knowledge. The growth of data will always outpace our ability to process them in full. And from that, for the Internet of Production, we derived the hypothesis, can we use digital shadows as a first-class citizen for production modeling and management in this setting? My second association, next step, was that I have somehow already seen such a setting in much of my and many other people's earlier research. We have been interested in database views. Yeah, Giancarlo, I have seen yet that you have raised your hand, but I think the agreement was that the questions can be asked afterwards. Sorry. Database views have been a topic of much research, both in the requirements engineering conceptual modeling field and IT security field. For example, if you have a very large problem, you model individual aspects or viewpoints of it. These viewpoints can then contradict with each other, and they can therefore lead to interesting, productive discussions. Also, in this way, they can, of course, this viewpoint resolution can be the basis for a specification for mappings between data views for data exchange. In addition, database views can be used to specify access control mechanisms with limited power, but they can be used. On the other hand, so that's a model view of views. Of course, the view definition in SQL can also be used as a modeling mechanism, but very limited in comparison to the broad uses I've just mentioned. At the same time, when you use this query aspect of views, then you can have the views as partially materialized data abstractions, which are pre-computed subdata for speed up. For example, like join indexes is one example in database implementation technologies. But it can also happen that you have only a collection of views available and you are not supposed to see the base data. It's obvious that this is a typical setting for data sovereignty. And so we needed algorithms in the early 2000s. The first of them were developed for finding out how just using the views and the rules for the derivation from the base data to know to rewrite queries automatically from this collection of views to questions to the individual data sources. Finally, the transport aspect that I mentioned can be covered here very well, namely updating externally materialized views with minimal data transfer, so small things that we want to move. And same thing for user-friendly update. The excellent keynote that Maurizio Lanzarini gave last year in CASE 2019 in Rome is a perfect overview of these formal mappings, activities, and so on. So I will skip that here and really recommend to you to read that. And I will look at other kinds of digital shadows because there are many of them. These ideas to merge classical models together with real-time data in order to find out the context. So merge model-driven and data-driven approaches. One example that probably everyone in the audience knows is navigation systems. Here you have something like simple adapt, or not simple, but advanced shortest path algorithms, like all the computer science students learn in their second semester. And at the same time, you enrich these with live data, which are, in the case of a company called TomTom, downloaded every few minutes from all the smartphones of one of their partners, Vodafone. So from these smartphone movements, they deduct what the traffic situation is, and then you come up with maps that look like this here, which give you congestion information and so on. So we see that as a nice early example of a digital shadow. The second digital shadow is an image understanding with some kind of minimal theory behind it. So on the left-hand side, we see, and lower part, we see autonomous car analytics done by my colleague Bastian Leibe here, who is obviously in computer vision. And also the relationship between modeling and real world analytics is shown very nicely on the right hand side in this picture, where the model is some kind of very simplistic frame model of the dancer or of the skateboard goer, and so it can be used as a training tool in practical work. Many sports companies are using that, as you probably have heard. Yeah. The third example I want to use is very known to all of you who have been in this community. It's and we're also using it heavily in the Internet of Production, which is process mining activities around Will van der Aalst and many colleagues like Stefanie Rinner-Lemar. Also the first talk of this keynote talk of this conference, Marlon Dumas. And here the idea is that you have sort of basic data, which are simply event logs, which vanish very quickly. Therefore, this analysis to the footprints on the beach, which vanish after every wave. So they are only there for a short time, but they can nevertheless be efficiently condensed and abstracted into multi-granularity process models for all kinds of purposes. So here the formal basis is Petri nets. And now I want to show one complex example from the production cluster research itself. This is one step in the life of this B column of a car. So typically you have the casting of slabs, of steel slabs. You have rolling step, which is the one that I want to look into briefly. Heating step, stamping step, which gives it the form, and then of course a long service life, especially if you have accidents around this. This is supposed to be the main thing that stabilizes your car. Key point is that this rolling step here, which looks very simple, you try basically to control the thickness and the granularity of the output by controlling the speed of movement of these individual rollers, and also the heating and cooling temperatures. And by that, you control all kinds of important aspects that will be important for the later steps, especially for the stability. This process itself, just the rolling, takes up about 7% of worldwide energy footprint, and therefore savings here are really important. In the first step, the model-based part was researched by the engineers for about 5-6 years, and they came up with 6 different reduced models, each from a different disciplines like chemistry, physics, different kinds of engineering, materials, product engineering, and so on, and also mathematicians. And this reduced the usual finite element simulation from 30 minutes to 4 hours to about 50 milliseconds. So by a factor of more than 100,000 at a good quality. And the point here is that before that, operators of such machinery, hot rolling machinery, had to rely more or less on their thing, and they could analyze maybe only one or two alternative plans to make a 24-hour schedule for the next day, so to speak. Now they could plan for many different things, but what they cannot plan for is, for example, first of all, starting from goals of granularity and thickness and going back, proposing schedules automatically. And second, it has to do with, it has to do with changes that happen during the aspect. So what we did there with our AI group was essentially to use data from the field and from these and to use them to train a neural network model where the training criterion, the quality criterion, was exactly the simplified reduced analytical models. So it could be trained reasonably fast from a lot of real and artificially generated schedule. And that then gives you in the future, still going on work, you have the chance to react with process changes to unexpected deviations, which was impossible before because it took much too long. And such unexpected deviations could, for example, happen if it starts to rain outside the factory, because this would already change the situation a lot. More we have, we can achieve better tolerances, so you can have a more courageous schedule, and you can also inform better the later steps in the process about the quality of your output. I mentioned the importance of moving such shadows around in the network, which has a lot to do with the speed. Here's an experiment from our communication engineering group in the cluster, which shows that if you if you put the shadow somehow in the cloud, far away, so to speak, in the internet from the machinery, you will not have stability in this reverse pendulum. But if you move this digital shadow model to the edge, then it will work quite fine. I summarize very briefly these different lights or fires that you can use for the digital shadow. I started with relational databases. I looked at discrete processes a la Will van der Aalst. I looked at continuous processes in my last example. I looked at the navigation system and also at multimedia data like these videos. In all of them, you have combinations of data-driven and model-driven approaches, and these combinations are quite a challenging research task. I will spend the last 2-3 minutes a little bit more on the business side. You can have a look at my keynote that I gave at the workshops of the last ER conference if you want to know more details here. So the first point that I just want to summarize, details are listed on the slide. We need a business modeling approach which is focused on exchange of services rather than of exchange of services for money. This, of course, reflects in aspects like the value propositions, the context in which something becomes valuable, and therefore in this idea of fair exchange. The second point is that we need these usage policies in order to have a fair sharing of the goals, and a specification of usage policies where you can allow your users exactly to see what what they need to see for their task, but not to see your company secret. So, for example, in such a supply chain risk analysis scenario, the supplier should only import the certain OEM data into the risk management system, not in other systems of the supplier, so he cannot pass it on to competitors, and he must keep these data only a very short time. And the same is the usage for particular tasks like risk or bottleneck management, but you are not supposed, the supplier does not like the OEM to use it for purchasing or goals. There are policy languages for specifying that kind of thing that have been implemented in our cluster, and which also again involve destruction of data. The architecture maybe is described also in the paper, so I will skip it here to leave time for questions. And I will come to the conclusion. We see this idea of data sovereignty and international data spaces somewhere in the middle between the data lake architecture and the blockchain architectures, with their focus, with our focus on data sovereignty and secure data exchange. For this particular purpose, we proposed technologies for trusted connectors and linkages, especially including data storage rules, data usage control rules, and of course, new mapping algorithms that take into account that only views on the data are visible beyond what Maurizio Lenziorini described last year. We need a suitable abstraction for describing the traded data objects, because otherwise we have nothing to talk about. So we hope that the digital settles are a good consequence for that. And then, of course, we need domain-specific service definitions, a lot of governance models, which look at the idea of capturing as much value as possible from this collaboration, but also appropriating this value in a fair way. Last point is that the European Commission has recently, just a few weeks ago, published its new data strategy, in which many of these ideas play an important role. For example, you see here our idea of secure and trusted data spaces, but also this cloud edge questions, and you see many different verticals, of which I have only mentioned one in this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias, for this very enlightening talk. I see there are already 2 questions. One is a question by Eric Dubois, so I will read it for you. Thanks for the excellent keynote, says Eric. In relation with the data sovereignty topic, what is your view on an approach where data are not transported? They stay where they are produced, but algorithms are move the data.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's, of course, a possibility. I did not mention it, but that's quite possible, but it's essentially only possible if you have already collected all the data that you need, where you have to apply the algorithm in one place, or you need a meta algorithm that, so to speak, that distributes the pieces of the algorithm, like in querying to heterogeneous databases, which I mentioned for the database views. You also basically you have to translate your query to to parcel your query into pieces. You have to then translate the query into the different languages that are used in the model, and later on you have to reverse this whole process to put the results together again. So if you just send an algorithm to one place where the data are, this is of course quite easy. If you have to also to cut the algorithm in pieces and maybe to use different sub-algorithms, because in the sources you have different capabilities of the sources, for example, to do something or to store the data, then things become tricky. So we have a lot of research questions here. And even if you do this sending, then basically the digital shadow is still the question whether it stays with the place where it was produced or whether it has to go to a third party again. And then, of course, it needs to be securely transported there.
Thank you, Matthias. I have on Wova spotted another question by Sabi Zahaf. And the question is very simple, but I guess it's tricky. It's kind of meta question, I think. The question is sovereignty a data? More precisely, a critical data?
Well, I think sovereignty is clearly something quite critical. I mean, we were really shocked to hear that if somebody steals the result of your data analysis, this is not, you would have to rely on physical aspects of stealing or something like that, because essentially you have no ownership on what you have computed. That's the situation in Europe. It's different in the US, and maybe this is also one of the reasons why we are a little bit back there. The sovereignty as such could also be, of course, described, and in that sense, it's also maybe a critical data. But as I said, sovereignty, like in the real world, is something to fight about. I mean, in Germany, we see the federal government fighting with the states fighting with the cities, and all of them fighting with the industry, and so on and so forth. Each of them wants to expand their sovereignty on how they can control what the other guys do, and or they want to loosen the other guy's sovereignty. And that's, of course, a major issue. So it's surely an artifact, such a negotiation, also to support it. And I very much liked the keynote yesterday of Thomas Vodel, who also looked at issues of that kind.
Thank you, Matthias. There is still room for a question if somebody wants to raise their hand. In the meantime, I have a question on my own. I liked very much the use of the Plato well-known metaphor of the shadow in the cave. And I think there is something particular. If you talk about digital shadows, you know, there is, when I started to work with database and I had all these, let's say, lectures when I was a student about a relational database. And when I started doing research on database, I worked on deductive database and active database. And now I can relate those kind of database with, for instance, ontologies, which have similar features. And if I think of these kinds of database, deductive or active database or ontologies, as technical support for digital shadows, then I have a particular kind of digital shadow, which is, there are non-extensive shadows, or shadows that don't provide extensive or explicit information about what they are supposed to represent. The information is hidden somewhere behind a mechanism that needs to be used to actually get the information that's embedded in the shadow. In other words, you have digital shadows that you can read that are explicit and digital shadows that are less explicit. And that's the same with neural systems. How can we handle that, especially in a relationship with sovereignty issues?
Right. I think in the case of the databases, regardless of whether ontology or more classical, you have this idea of the digital shadow, which links in a fixed way, so to speak, the way how the shadow was created. For example, the query formulation to the query formulation to the data that have been computed, or the ontologies that you have, ontological concepts that you have used in processing the queries and so on. So there are things work quite fine. With the neural networks, indeed, we have a problem which is known as explainable AI, that people are trying to find ways to put some kind of theory or at least hypothesis what this neural network might have thought, so to speak, or to make it more plausible what has been learned there. So that's a problem that is ongoing research, I think, in the AI community.
Thank you. Oh, I see Jarke has raised a question. Let me try, Jarke, if you are here, let me try to give you the voice to ask your question on your own. Jarke, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Jarke, great to hear you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, great keynote. An impressive project. My compliments. I wish we had that also in my domain. Essentially, as you might know, that we are also working in the area of software ecosystems, and but you did not treat the concept of software ecosystem at all in your talk. I can imagine for simplicity reasons, but let's say in your data ecosystem, the data is exchanged by many parties, but all those parties have different instances of the system because of different releases and local updating and third party updates. So the software ecosystem is kind of also interfering with your data ecosystem. So my question is, can the data ecosystem be treated independently from the software ecosystem? Are they the same? Can you use the view? Is the view a procedural view, or isn't the software ecosystem essential for establishing the digital twin? So I appreciate your views.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Indeed, that's another perspective on this infrastructure, for which, by the way, there was also a paper for a relatively small example in this conference by Dalibor et al. So in principle, of course, the software that is used, thinking would be, let's say, the implementational part of the model. Okay, so that's maybe not so it would be linked to the shadow in this way, and of course the choice of software, also the maintenance of software, is then in that sense a part of the evolution. Okay, but for me, the software would be, if I have this duality, or this Janos head, as we call it, Janos head from the Roman god, that it would be on the model side, but then of course on the implementation of the model side. If you go to the meta modeling level, you could then of course distinguish both there. And that's how I think this can be integrated. But indeed, we have focused on the data ecosystem in much of the recent work, because in the software ecosystem, there's much more, how shall I say it, excellent work going on already.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see Arne has raised his hand, so I'm going to give him the ability to go.
Now I'm getting really afraid.
That should be the last question. Arne, are you there? Wait, it doesn't work. Arne? I can't. Arne has left actually the conference. Okay, so I can't find. Arne has left the conference, the webinar. I think I can't find him anymore. So it will be probably the last question. Anyway, it's 5 minutes past 11:30. Thank you everybody for your questions, for attending the keynote. Now there are 3 sessions: tutorial 5, session 7 on application of artificial intelligence and big data in information systems, and the forum, session 2. So you can find the links to access those in the Wova. Thank you, Matthias. I guess everybody is uploading behind their computer, and see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you.